Okay.
Fragmentation of the Palestinian society and the dispossession of their lands are key pillars of Israel's apartheid system to maintain domination and control. But there's more.
Okay, that's accurate. And that's actually more accuracy than I expected. How are they going to deal with the fact that a fucking mainstream human rights organization... No, yeah, I mean, how are they going to deal with the fact it's just the most mainstream human rights organizations around are now saying this?
The unequal structure of nationality and status, restrictions on freedom of movement, use of military rule, denial of right to political participation or the right to peaceful protest, and cruel separation of families all add to the complex system that we see today.
This video makes the heavy accusation that Israel is in fact an apartheid state.
Which it is. I mean, like, there is a legal definition for the term apartheid. It fits that definition. There's also, I mean, and even before that, and, like, the people who fought against apartheid in South Africa have, like, one by one, have, gone to Palestine and been like, holy shit, this is actually worse than the horrible shit we fought against.
But is it true? It's really important to get the bigger picture of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and our 5-minute video does just that.
Maybe you've heard someone say that Israel is an apartheid state, that Israel has a policy of segregating and oppressing the minority population.
Well, minority population isn't quite right. First of all, why is everybody blue? What the fuck? Yeah, what are these Smurfs? It's the indigenous population, and the only reason they're in the minority is because first Israel kicked out 750,000 of them in 1948, then drew the line, a green line, like arbitrarily, just to ensure that they had this settler majority, and even that hasn't been enough to actually maintain a majority
within its borders, like South Africa once did. Maybe you've been so outraged by this information that you have considered joining the BDS movement, the effort to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel until it ends its alleged racist policies. I don't blame you. Apartheid is a great evil and deserves to be fought where...
Well, okay, she's a South African human rights activist. Let's look her up. Olga Michaud. Who is she? Daisy International. Who the fuck are they? An investment company on Vosloorus, South Africa. Oh, it is a literal... She's not a human rights activist. This is Defend, Embrace, Invest in, Support Israel. It is a South African-based Christian pro-Israel advocacy group. So, she's not a human rights activist. She's literally the opposite of a human rights activist. She is an anti-human rights activist. South African human rights activist. My ass.
Wherever we find it. But here's the thing. You won't find apartheid in the state of Israel. So, I'll put it bluntly. The BDS movement is a slick propaganda effort built on lies.
You mean kind of like calling yourself a human rights activist when you are literally not that thing? Is a slick propaganda effort built on... You're on PragerU right now. That's kind of a slick propaganda effort built on lies.
I think I have the credibility to make this claim. Having grown up in South Africa and having spent...
Okay, she has the credibility to make this... Okay, let's see, how... When... Do we have her birth date? LinkedIn. Club Z. I'm curious. Okay. Regent University. Okay, so she's been involved in right-wing shit since she was in university. She went to fucking Regent University, which is a far-right fundamentalist Christian fake university.
A fair amount of time in Israel. I know what apartheid is and what it is not. My parents were raised under real apartheid, where blacks were, by law, separated from whites at every level, from education to drinking fountains.
Okay, so this is what's called petty apartheid, uh, which happens to be in many ways the most visible because you have the signs saying like, net blancas and stuff like that. But on the other hand, it is not the overall thing. I mean, it is part of it. But the bigger picture was what was called relocation. Created these fake ass homelands like Bophuthatswana, and they just sort of like took all the indigenous population out of the lands that the white settlers wanted, dumped them in these places, and then claimed they were sovereign countries and, denied them representation in the political system.
Blacks couldn't vote, couldn't own land.
Okay, so far we're not. These are similarities. Most Palestinians can't vote either in Israel. They also can't own land because the Jewish Agency controls most of the land within Israel. And the Jewish Agency is not, by its charter, is not allowed to make land available to people who are not of Jewish ethnicity.
Couldn't live next to or use the same transportation system as whites.
Well, isn't it embarrassing to your argument that just recently a whole bunch of Palestinians were forced to get off of a bus so that Jews could take their seats?
I remember my father telling me about how my grandfather was kicked and humiliated in public by a young white boy.
You mean sort of like what happens with when the settlers in the West Bank decide that they're gonna fuck with Palestinians who are just trying to take their kids to school or harvest their fucking olives? You mean the stuff that happens literally every fucking day?
All he was permitted to say was, "Please stop, little boss."
You mean, okay, so you keep on listing all these. When are we going to get to the differences, though? You said that it's totally different. You're describing, like, literally. You're describing all the fucking similarities.
That was the world my family lived in.
That's the world Palestinians live in, except with the addition that a fucking high-tech Air Force bombs them regularly. And this is precisely why people who actually fought against apartheid, who, in South Africa, said at the time, our freedom isn't complete. I mean, Mandela, for example, said our freedom isn't complete without the freedom of the Palestinians. Plenty of other people who are in the struggle have said since then that what Israel does, no matter how as bad as apartheid South Africa was, they weren't sending the Air Force to bomb Soweto.
That was the world of apartheid South Africa. But in Israel, the law is colorblind. Israeli Arabs have the same right.
Okay, see, that's cute. See, they say Israeli Arabs because the idea is to pretend that the Palestinians inside the Green Line are somehow fundamentally different ethnicity than the Palestinians on the other side of it.
Rights as Israeli Jews.
That's actually also not true. For example, if a Palestinian citizen of Israel marries a Palestinian who's not a citizen of Israel, solely because she's a Palestinian and he's a Palestinian, she cannot use that in order to get permission to live within the Green Line with the Palestinian citizen of Israel she just married. If, on the other hand, if they were both Jewish, this doesn't even come up because Jews literally have a pretty much automatic right to citizenship in Israel, just waiting for them. I mean, it's just absolutely absurd. Why is everybody fucking blue?
They ride the same buses, study in the same schools,
And actually, this is all very much not true.
and are treated in the same hospitals.
Also not true. In fact, Palestinians have to get permission in order to... Like, for one thing, most Palestinians live in the See, what she's doing is this is literally the apartheid strategy as well. I have to back up because this is really deep. Because the way that South Africa, under the apartheid regime, claimed that they weren't violating the equality rights of the indigenous black population was they said, oh, you know, you're talking about people in Bophuthatswana. That's Bophuthatswana. That's another fucking country. That's totally different. Of course they can't vote in our elections. They're in a different country. You know, of course they're not, you know, entitled to the same civil rights as citizens of the Union of South Africa because they're in a different country that we made up specifically so that we could deny them their rights. And that is literally what she's doing here. She is using a bullshit distinction specifically used in order to do racism more effectively and saying, okay, we don't have to even deal with the rest of the Palestinians who are outside the Green Line. Because that's a whole different thing. That's nothing to do with these Israeli Arabs.
Arabs are elected to Israel's parliament.
And practically every election there is an attempt to ban all of the Palestinian parties.
Serve as judges and fight in the Israeli military.
Actually, most of them don't, because the Israeli military does not really want them.
On my first trip to Israel, the group I was with had a Jewish tour guide and an Arab bus driver. Imagine our surprise having heard that Israel is an apartheid state.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure you were totally surprised by this, the fucking junket that you probably organized from... Yeah, I mean, this is Israel's whole propaganda thing. They're like, hey, look, you know, they're Israeli Arabs and they're getting along with, you know, Israeli Jews and it's all cool. I mean, this is their whole message. Of course they...
This would have been inconceivable in apartheid South Africa.
That's not true, actually. There was what was called the Rebel Tour of South Africa. See, South Africa, under the apartheid regime, was cut off from international sporting events. But they kind of wanted to do international sporting events. They wanted to get the big names, in cricket, for example, to come to South Africa. And so they approached cricketers, particularly in the teams that did not pay very well, like the West Indies, and said, here, we'll pay you a whole lot of money if you play a tour of South Africa, even though the ICC, the International Cricket Conference, tells you you're not allowed to. And and what they did was they actually told you know, because you know they're talking to the West Indies team because that was like the hottest team in the 1980s, and so they said, and the West Indies team is black. Like I mean that it's an almost all black. Back then I think it was an all black team. These days it isn't exclusively. There are people of South Asian descent as well, and so you know obviously you know they were somewhat you know, and going to South Africa and you're being invited to South Africa and you're black sounds like something that might be a little bit, like you might be a bit concerned about it. And they said, no, don't worry about that. We're not going to do anything bad to you. You're going to be honorary whites for the duration of the tour. And it's like, just so we can show that actually we treat black people really well. I mean, they did the exact same shit. They used the exact same lines. The only difference is they didn't say it isn't apartheid because they invented the term, thinking that that would actually make everything sound better.
All these things would be self-evident to anyone who did any kind of actual research, or even better, visited Israel.
Okay. The thing is, I have Palestinian friends who still aren't actually allowed to do that just because they're Palestinians. Whereas I, who have no connection to that country at all, just because I've got a Jewish mother, can just go over there, and the government will pay me money in order to take Palestinians' land, and they will even just let me have a passport without all that much bureaucracy. So, yeah, there is kind of a little bit of racism. And the thing about doing minimum research when you are, like, cosplaying a human rights activist, is you don't want to encourage people to do research, because then they look you up, and it's like, oh, wow, you're just a pro-Israel shill. That's your whole thing.
Something I encourage everyone to do. BDS doesn't want you to research or visit Israel.
Well, we don't. Yeah, the Palestinian BDS campaign specifically doesn't want people to visit Israel because that drives tourist dollars to Israel, and Israel's actually kind of dependent on that stuff. And the idea is to starve them of funds. They do want you to research. I mean, they'll give you all sorts of, there's plenty. Because the thing is, the minute you actually look into just even the mainstream international organizations like the UN, and totally mainstream human rights groups like Amnesty International or even Human Rights Watch, which is practically a subsidiary of the U.S. State Department, outright say, it's apartheid.
It depends on the ignorance of its audience. Sadly, on American college campuses, BDS has a significant presence.
Why the fuck is everybody blue?
It succeeds by playing on the good intentions of good people through deliberate deception.
You mean sort of like calling yourself a human rights activist when you've never done any human rights activism?
In short, they lie. And lies really make me angry because lies empower.
These lies are my fucking job.
Evil. Lies about blacks empowered apartheid in South Africa.
Lies about Palestinians empower apartheid in Israel.
Lies about Jews made the Holocaust possible. And lies about Israel are misleading a lot of good-hearted young people into opposing the only country in the entire Middle East that doesn't segregate and oppress its minority population.
Except that it literally does those things.
Just ask the next Egyptian Copt or Iraqi Christian you meet on campus.
Oh, okay, so there's a classic thing, a classic article by Jews Sans Frontières that talks about making the case for Israel and winning. It's a satire, but they say, here's what you got to do. First, you say, we're awesome, and you talk about how great Israel actually is, and then you say, everybody else sucks. And there's a whole order to this, because the idea is if people aren't convinced that Israel's awesome, well, then you have to move on to the next step, and the next step is to claim that everybody else sucks, and that therefore Israel by default is just the better option. I mean, and who actually has been controlling Iraq for quite a long time? And by the way, Egypt is one of Israel's closest fucking allies.
So the question people should really be asking is, what does the BDS movement want?
And the BDS movement actually specifically says it's easy. Tear down the apartheid wall, an end to the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, full equal rights for the indigenous population, and a right to return for the refugees. I mean, it's kind of a thing. They're kind of explicit about it specifically because it's a thing. That's what the BDS movement wants.
The answer is simple. They want to destroy Israel.
But wait, I mean, the only way... So you're saying that a demand for equal rights would destroy Israel? That sounds like you're saying that Israel cannot exist unless it denies equal rights, which is specifically... I remember earlier in this video you were trying to make the point that that wasn't an issue. Because, I mean, it's interesting that they use this line. Because their whole thing is that supposedly Israel provides equal rights. Well, the demand is for equal rights. So, should they just say they've already done that? Instead, they say equal rights will destroy Israel.
They can't do it militarily, so they try to do it through lies. They say that Jews have no historic claim to Israel. Lie. They say that Israel treats its Arabs as second-class citizens.
True. Well, actually, yeah, I mean, the thing is, well, it's Arabs, first of all. Fuck off. These are people who lived there for centuries, and the country you're defending is barely older than a bottle of Johnny Walker Blue Label.
Lie. They say that Israel doesn't want peace with
yeah, that's true. Israel very clearly doesn't want
its Arab
peace.
neighbors. Lie.
Those Arab neighbors include the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and Israel hasn't been very peaceful towards them.
If you tell lies and you tell them often enough, people who don't know the truth start to believe them.
Yes, and that is the entire thinking behind PragerU.
The BDS movement's leaders barely tried to hide this charade. They will lie and say that they only want a Palestinian state living...
That's actually not one of the BDS demands. Like, there are 4 fucking demands. They're explicit. You can go to the BDS campaign website and you'll find those demands. They are prominent because the demands themselves actually kind of diffuse a lot of these talking points.
Living side by side with Israel. And then they say this: we oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine.
Well, yes, because the thing is that the only reason, I mean, first of all, Israel's not a Jewish state. It is a Zionist state. The idea that it's a Jewish state is just anti-Semitic bullshit, because it's the idea is to equate Israel with all Jews. Zionists love to do this, and it's anti-Semitic, and it doesn't become less anti-Semitic because Zionists love to do it. The thing is that the only claim Israel has to being a Jewish state is that Jews have more legal rights than anyone else in that state, including the indigenous population who've lived there for centuries.
Ending the occupation doesn't mean anything if it doesn't mean upending the Jewish state itself.
I wonder if there was anything in that ellipsis that might have provided some context. Okay. We have nothing but right-wing organizations even mentioning this quote. And these ellipses are all over the place. Okay. Okay, here we go. Ending. So, let me just see. How do they... Okay. So what we're finding is this ellipsis suggests that these two things are for one quote, but let me see. Any part. Yeah, okay, these are separate things. I mean, this is not one quote that they've ellipsed something. This is two things that are cobbled together from two totally different sources. Okay, this is from an article by Ahmed Moore, Upending. I view the BDS movement as a long-term project with radically transformative potential. I believe the ultimate success of the BDS movement will be coincident with the ultimate success of Palestinian enfranchisement and equal rights movement. In other words, BDS is not another step on the way to the final showdown. BDS is the final showdown. This belief grows directly from the conviction that nothing resembling the two-state solution will ever come into being. Ending the occupation doesn't mean anything if it doesn't mean upending the Jewish, sick, state itself. That's because, as Yair Wallach writes, the occupation appears increasingly as de facto permanent feature of the Israeli system of government, rather than as a set of temporary policies and security measures, and inevitably the occupation involves the disenfranchisement and denial of collective political rights for the Palestinians. So, this isn't a quote. This isn't one person necessarily even saying this. We oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. Let me see, where do we get that? We oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. Yeah, that is from... Okay. Omar Barghouti. But the other thing is from fucking Amir Moore. Amir... Yeah, this is... And apparently, again, surprisingly enough, it turns out Omar Barghouti does not consider the way that his words have been characterized to be particularly accurate. And considering that it's all fucking right-wing groups that are using that fucking quote, I can kind of see why. So, in short, this is not an Omar Barghouti quote. The first part is a part of an Omar Barghouti quote. The second part is from a completely different source, written by a completely different person. And, by the way, fun fact, let's see. When did he say this? Okay. Okay, get this. This is from 2019. The article that has the second part here is from 2010. This is 2019. Omar Barghouti. This other thing, 2010, by, see here, April 22, 2010, Ahmed Moore. So, not only that, the chronology is a lie. This is not just not a quote from one person. It's not just not a quote from one source. This was written in 2019 by Omar Barghouti. This was written in 2010 by Ahmed Moore. You literally cannot find this treated as a single quote, except in fucking far-right sources that are lying.
That's from Omar Barghouti,
No, it isn't.
a founder
You fucking liar.
of BDS. Barghouti lives in Israel, so you might expect that he said this from inside an Israeli prison, like Nelson Mandela during South Africa apartheid.
And Israel repeatedly has threatened to lock him up.
You would be wrong. Barghouti is a PhD student at Israel's Tel Aviv University, where he enjoys the same rights as every Israeli.
No, he doesn't.
My
and
parents
okay, yes, and he,
The only dream of that kind of freedom.
yeah, and he gets a piece. He's a Palestinian citizen of Israel.
Is Israel a perfect country? No. There are as many perfect countries as there are perfect people. But to call it an apartheid state is not only an insult to the only democracy in the Middle East,
The only democracy, if you don't count the roughly half of the population who aren't allowed to vote.
and the only country with equal rights for all its minorities.
That's actually not true.
It's also an insult to the actual victims of apartheid.
Yeah, which is why I find it interesting that so many actual people who actually fought against apartheid, who actually had fucking blood, sweat, and tears into that struggle, have been the ones to point it out, like Desmond Tutu, for example, like Ronnie Casseroles, quite a few others. I mean, Mandela himself, for fuck's sake.
Like my parents and all those who suffered under it. I'm Olga Mishra for Prager University.
Oh god.